Rincewind reached the broken drum at a dead run, and was just in time to collide with a man who came out backwards, fast. The stranger's haste was in part accounted for by the spear in his chest. He bubbled noisily and dropped dead at the wizard's feet. Rincewind peered around the door frame and jerked back as a heavy throwing axe whirred past like a partridge. It was probably a lucky throw. A second cautious glance told him. The dark interior of the drum was a broil of fighting men, quite a number of them. A third and longer glance confirmed, in bits. Rincewind swayed back as a wildly thrown stool sailed past and smashed on the far side of the street. Then he dived in. He was wearing a dark robe, made darker by constant wear and irregular washings. In the raging gloom, no one appeared to notice a shadowy shape that shuffled desperately from table to table. At one point, a fighter, staggering back, trod on what felt like fingers. A number of what felt like teeth bit his ankle. He yelped shrilly and dropped his guard just sufficiently for a sword, swung by a surprised opponent, to skewer him. Rincewind reached the doorway, sucking his bruised hand and running with a curious bent-over gait. A crossbow quarrel thunked into the banister rail above him, and he gave a whimper. He made the stairs in one breathless rush, expecting at any moment another, more accurate shot. In the corridor above, he stood upright, gasping, and saw the floor in front of him scattered with bodies. A big, black-bearded man with a bloody sword in one hand was trying a door handle. "Hey!" screamed Rincewind. The man looked around and then, almost absent-mindedly, drew a short throwing knife from his bandolier and hurled it. Rincewind ducked. There was a brief scream behind him as the crossbowman, sighting down his weapon, dropped it and clutched at his throat. The big man was already reaching for another knife. Rincewind looked around wildly and then, with wild improvisation, drew himself up into a wizardly pose. His hand was flung back. "Asenaiti ki Ruchu Beelzeblor!" The man hesitated, his eyes flicking nervously from side to side as he waited for the magic. The conclusion that there was not going to be any hit him at the same time as Rincewind, whirring wildly down the passage, kicked him sharply in the groin. As he screamed and clutched at himself, the wizard dragged open the door, sprang inside, slammed it behind him, and threw his body against it, panting. It was quiet in here. There was Two Flower, sleeping peacefully on the low bed. And there, at the foot of the bed, was the luggage. Rincewind took a few steps forward, cupidity moving him as easily as if he were on little wheels. The chest was open. There were bags inside, and in one of them he caught the gleam of gold. For a moment, greed overcame caution, and he reached out gingerly. But what was the use? He'd never lived to enjoy it. Reluctantly, he drew his hand back and was surprised to see a slight tremor in the chest's open lid. Hadn't it shifted slightly as though rocked by the wind? Rincewind looked at his fingers and then at the lid. It looked heavy and was bound with brass beads. It was quite still now. What wind? Rincewind! Two Flower sprang off the bed. The wizard jumped back, wrenching his features into a smile. "My dear chap, right on time. We'll just have lunch, and then I'm sure you've got a wonderful program lined up for this afternoon." That's great." Rincewind took a deep breath. "Look," he said desperately, "let's eat somewhere else. There's been a bit of a fight down below." "A tavern brawl? Why didn't you wake me up?" "Well, you see, What?" I thought I made myself quite clear this morning, Rincewind. I want to see genuine Morporkian life. The slave market, the whore pitch, the temple of small gods, the beggars' guild, and a genuine tavern brawl. A faint note of suspicion entered Two Flower's voice. You do have them, don't you? You know, people swinging on chandelier, sword fights over the table, the sort of thing Hrun the Barbarian and the Weasel are always getting involved in. You know, excitement. Rincewind sat down heavily on the bed. You want to see a fight? He said. Yes. What's wrong with that? For a start, people get hurt. Oh, I wasn't suggesting we get involved. I just want to see one, that's all. And some of your famous heroes. You do have some, don't you? It's not all dockside talk. And now, to the wizard's astonishment, Two Flower was almost pleading. Oh, yeah, we have them all right, said Rincewind hurriedly. He pictured them in his mind and recoiled from the thought. All the heroes of the Circle Sea passed through the gates of Ankh-Morpork sooner or later. Most of them were from the barbaric tribes nearer the frozen hub, which had a sort of export trade in heroes. Almost all of them had crude magic swords, whose unsuppressed harmonics on the astral plane played hell with any delicate experiments in applied sorcery for miles around. But Rincewind didn't object to them on that score. He knew himself to be a magical dropout, so it didn't bother him that the mere appearance of a hero at the city gates was enough to cause retorts to explode and demons to materialize all through the magical quarter. No, what he didn't like about heroes was that they were usually suicidally gloomy when sober and homicidally insane when drunk. There were too many of them, too. Some of the most notable questing grounds near the city were a veritable hubbub in the season. There was talk of organizing a rota. He rubbed his nose. The only heroes he had much time for were Bravd and the Weasel, who were out of town at the moment, and Hrun the Barbarian, who was practically an academic by hub standards in that he could think without moving his lips. Hrun was said to be roving somewhere turnwise. Look, he said at last, have you ever met a barbarian? Two Flowers shook his head. I was afraid of that, said Rincewind. Well, there was a clatter of running feet in the street outside, and a fresh uproar from downstairs. It was followed by a commotion on the stairs. The door was flung open before Rincewind could collect himself sufficiently to make a dash for the window. But instead of the greed-crazed madman he expected, he found himself looking into the round red face of a sergeant of the watch. He breathed again. Of course. The watch were always careful not to intervene too soon in any brawl where the odds were not heavily stacked in their favor. The job carried a pension and attracted a cautious, thoughtful kind of man. The sergeant glowered at Rincewind and then peered at Two Flower with interest. Everything all right here, then? He said. Oh, fine, said Rincewind. Got held up, did you? The sergeant ignored him. This the foreigner, then? He inquired. We were just leaving, said Rincewind quickly, and switched to Trobe. Two Flower, I think we ought to get lunch somewhere else. I know some places. He marched out into the corridor with as much aplomb as he could muster. Two Flower followed, and a few seconds later there was a strangling sound from the sergeant as the luggage closed its lid with a snap, stood up, stretched, and marched after them. Watchmen were dragging bodies out of the room downstairs. There were no survivors. The watch had ensured this by giving them ample time to escape via the back door. A neat compromise between caution and justice that benefited all parties. Who are all these men? Said Two Flower. Oh, you know, just men, said Rincewind, and before he could stop himself, some part of his brain that had nothing to do took control of his mouth and added, heroes, in fact. Really? When one foot is stuck in the gray miasma of Hurl, it is much easier to step right in and sink rather than prolong the struggle. Rincewind let himself go. Yes, that one over there is Erig Strong in the arm. Over there is Black Zenel. Is Rund the Barbarian here? Said Two Flower, looking around eagerly. Rincewind took a deep breath. That's him behind us, he said. The enormity of this lie was so great that its ripples did in fact spread out one of the lower astral planes as far as the magical quarter across the river, where it picked up tremendous velocity from the huge standing wave of power that always hovered there and bounced wildly across the Circle Sea. A harmonic got as far as Hrun himself, currently fighting a couple of gnolls on a crumbling ledge high in the Cataract Mountains, and caused him a moment's unexplained discomfort. Two Flower, meanwhile, had thrown back the lid of the luggage and was hastily pulling out a heavy black cube. This is fantastic, he said. They're never going to believe this at home. What's he going on about? Said the sergeant doubtfully. He's pleased you rescued us, said Rincewind. He looked sidelong at the black box, half expecting it to explode or emit strange musical tones. Ah, said the sergeant. He was staring at the box, too. Two Flower smiled brightly at them. I'd like a record of the event, he said. Do you think you could ask them all to stand over by the window, please? This won't take a moment. And, Rincewind? Yes. Two Flower stood on tiptoe to whisper, I expect you know what this is, don't you? Rincewind stared down at the box. It had a round glass eye protruding from the center of one face, and a lever at the back. Not wholly, he said. It's a device for making pictures quickly, said Two Flower. Quite a new invention. I'm rather proud of it, but look, I don't think these gentlemen would. Well, I mean, they might be sort of apprehensive. Could you explain it to them? I'll reimburse them for their time, of course. He's got a box with a demon in it that draws pictures, said Rincewind shortly. Do what the madman says, and he will give you gold. The watch smiled nervously. I'd like you in the picture, Rincewind. That's fine. Two Flower took out the golden disc that Rincewind had noticed before, squinted at its unseen face for a moment, muttered, 30 seconds should about do it, and said brightly, Smile, please. Smile, rasped Rincewind. There was a whirr from the box. Right? Right,